Hi, I'm Michelle Atkinson. I'm an environmental horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Service. And today we're going to talk about the landscape best management practices, which are a requirement of the fertilizer ordinance in Manatee County. So anyone who does any type of landscape maintenance in Manatee County is required to take this course and have a certificate along with a decal that our code enforcers look for. Maybe you've already met our code enforcers out in the field and that's why you've come to watch this class. So today we're going to talk about some different topics. We're going to cover water quality and pruning, a little bit about fertilization, a little bit about pesticide and irrigation. There is a pre-test and a post-test if you're in our classrooms. If you're not in our classrooms, at the end of the video, I'm going to instruct you on how to come in to take the exam or the test so that you can get your certificate and decal. So in Manatee County, if you do any kind of landscape business, you are required to have this class. So if you get paid for landscape services under our fertilizer ordinance, you are required to take this class. If you apply fertilizer, not only in Manatee County, but in the entire state of Florida, you're required to have another class or a different class called the Green Industry Best Management Practices. That will allow you, after passing that test, to get a fertilizer license. And that license is good throughout our state. But even if you have a license, a fertilizer license, you still have to record it with Manatee County to get your decal and your certificate. Our code enforcers, when they come and check on folks, that's what they're looking for, is that decal and that certificate. So again, anyone in Manatee County, if you're pruning trees, if you're just mowing and blowing, everyone needs to have this certification. The certification is good for a lifetime. You do not have to renew it at any point. So once you take this class, you're good. Just don't lose your certificate. If you do, you can go downtown to our second floor and get a replacement certificate, so you're good. So what is a BMP? Well, that's a best management practice. And simply put, you are the ones out in the field. You're mowing and blowing, pruning, planting, watering, taking care of folks' pest problems possibly, and teaching your clients, your customers, about how to care for their landscapes. You make the difference out in the landscape, and in that, we want you to be professional with your outreach to your clients and understand the information that you're giving them. So this class is to help you a little bit with that, and also to teach you about a very important issue here in Manatee County, which is our water quality issues. So why are we here and why do we have to go through this training? Well, ultimately, the fertilizer ordinance is in place to protect our water quality. We have impaired bodies of water around, which means that they're not meeting the quality that's necessary for the EPA to say it's okay to recreate in that water. So that's why we got the fertilizer ordinance, is because we had these, problem bodies of water, poor water quality, and we needed to do something. So something that we set in place was this fertilizer ordinance, which requires you to come to this training. So the primary cause, the main reason of this in most fertilizer ordinances is really to protect our water quality. So as we go through the next section, we're going to define what an impervious surface is. We're going to talk about non-point source pollution and what diverse sources of pollution mean. So we live in a great place, not just Florida, but Manatee County. We have great fishing, great beaches. Everybody comes to Manatee County really for our great water resources, to look at them, to enjoy them, to play on them. And we want to protect that, because if we don't, then we won't have folks to work for, because they won't want to live here anymore if the water's stinky and gross and we can't eat the fish that we catch. So it's really important that we try our best to protect that. I have to be honest, I'm a fisherman. I like to go scalloping and I like to eat what I catch. So it's really important to me and my family that we keep the water clean. So pollution can cause a lot of problems. Not only can it, put a lot of plastic in the ocean, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but it can cause these algae blooms. When we have a lot of algae in the water, it takes the oxygen out of the water, which kills fish. then we have just a stinky mess. And we saw that with red tide. We saw that with the blue-green algae bloom, and now we get the flesh-eating bacteria that's come along as well. So it's really important that we keep our water clean to try to help prevent some of these issues out there. So what is point source pollution? Well, I grew up in Manatee County and we have Tropicana. So I would walk outside sometimes when I was a little kid and I would smell burnt oranges. And that was Tropicana processing the oranges, the orange juice. So I could point to Tropicana and say, okay, this air pollution that I smell is from Tropicana. I knew exactly where it was coming from. So when we see smokestacks or we see runoff coming from one particular company, we can point to that company and know where it's coming from. But what we worry about, we can point to a source, we can go and talk to them and fix that problem. But what we can't fix sometimes is the non-point source pollution, because we really don't know who it's coming from. So if you have a stormwater pond, let's say, and the stormwater pond gets that lovely algae in it, like this right here, maybe not. So in the one picture of the algae, we can't tell which home contributed to the water quality in that pond. We don't know which home it was that caused that problem. And it probably wasn't just one house. It was probably many homes around the pond that caused that problem. So we can't point to it and find out who is the problem. So when we can't point to the source, we call it non-point source pollution. And non-point source pollution comes from many different diverse sources. So it can be trash coming in, it can be oil from the road, fertilizers, pesticides, dog poop, and pet waste that can enter into these bodies of water. So many different diverse sources is making up the problem in the ponds and in our waterways. So what is an impervious surface? Well, I usually stomp on the ground when I say this. So an impervious surface is a hard surface, something that water will not go through. Our roads, our sidewalks, driveways, those are all impervious surfaces. Why do we talk about impervious surfaces? Well, when things get on impervious surfaces, like grass clippings and fertilizers and pesticides, where does it go? Well, it gets washed away with the rainwater or the irrigation water or even the wind. So when things that don't belong on these surfaces land on them, like grass clippings, they get carried off somewhere else. And so when something like that lands on a hard surface or an impervious surface, we need to do something with that. And we'll talk more about that. So more development means more impervious surface. In the 1984 photo, that was State Road 70 and the interstate I-75 back in 1984. And you can see lots of open land there, trees, and now look at the 2018 photo. So what do you think happened when the rain fell in 1984? So the rain would fall and it would probably absorb a lot into the ground. And when it goes into the ground, it goes through the soils, which is a great filter system, and into the aquifer. So it was recharging the aquifer. But in 2018, what do you think happens to the water? So now it's hitting rooftops, driveways, sidewalks, roads, and it's all flowing into things that we put in the roads called storm drains or catchments. And where do those go to? Well, a lot of times they go to stormwater ponds. Sometimes they go right out into the Manatee River. Sometimes they go out into the intercoastal or right into the Gulf of Mexico if you live out on the barrier islands. So when it's flowing off of these surfaces, it's going somewhere. It's going into a body of water somewhere, and it's taking all the pollution with it. So as we develop, more and more hard surfaces can be sources for more and more pollution. So an impervious surface leads to a storm drain. Just like I was saying, in the roadways, we have those catchments, those storm water catchments in the roads, and those go out into a river, a stream, a lake, a pond, the Gulf, or the ocean. Up north, sometimes in some places, they route those stormwater pipes in with their sewer pipes, and they use it for water treatment. I say that because folks come down from up north to live with us. You know, we get lots of winter friends. And they think that that drain, that stormwater drain in the road, is actually going to a sewer treatment plant because that's how it worked in the place that they're from. But ours don't do that. Ours go right into the pond. Usually you can look around and see where it's draining out to because the water body is usually pretty close nearby. So sometimes I've seen folks actually scoop up their dog poop, put it in a bag, and throw it into the stormwater drain because they don't realize it's headed into a pond. So those folks, it's, you know, if you feel comfortable, it's nice to just educate them a little bit and let them know that that's going right over into that stormwater pond. There's no filter from the road to the pond. It's an open tube drain system. So anything that enters that stormwater catchment in the roadway goes straight into the pond. Doesn't go to a treatment center like some places. Okay, this can be what those things look like. Sometimes they look like this. Hopefully they don't look like this because this one is full of pollution, plastics and just trash. So when you're out maintaining landscapes, help us all out. Pick up the trash. I watched a guy one day, instead of picking up a bag of chips, you know, an old chip bag laying in the yard, he mowed over it. So guess what happened to that bag of chips? It went from one piece of trash to 20 pieces of trash spread all over the place. So just take the time, pick up some of the pollution that you see so you can help out our waterways. So this I took when I was up in Gainesville. It's at Sweetwater Preserve. They have a catchment area for trash. And so what this is, Sweetwater Preserve catches all the stormwater runoff from the city of Gainesville and drains it down into the Paynes Prairie Swamp area. And this catchment was just full of trash. And look in the water. What do you see most of? What do you think those little white things are? Most of them are styrofoam cups. And I know you guys and gals are out and it's hot and you're maintaining landscapes and you stop and get one of those inexpensive, you know, Polar Pops or other, you know, whoever has the inexpensive soda, which is great and you got to cool yourself down. But make sure you're taking care of your cups. If you're throwing them in the back of the truck or the trailer, they're just blowing out and ending up in our water like these are. So a lot of those places actually will let you use reusable cups, and some of them even don't. They'll give you a discount if you bring your cup in. So you might think about doing that. So what happens to the trash and all the pollution when it ends up in our bodies of water? Well, it, you know, floats along and it ends up out into the oceans. And each one of our oceans now have a gyre in them. It's a big area of trash, essentially. We have currents in these oceans, and there's usually a place where the currents kind of are circling, and it causes all the pollution to end up in one spot of the various oceans. So we have these huge gyres, which are just you know, full of plastics and garbage. The one that I'm showing here in the North Pacific is actually the size of Texas. That's how big these things are, just full of trash. And a lot of people think that they're like floating trash islands, and that's really not what they are. If you were to go out in a boat and look at this, you really wouldn't see the trash because it looks like this. These little pieces of plastic that have kind of broken down some, they're all in the water. So if you were to take a net and strain through the water, then you'd find all of this stuff. It's not just, you know, a dump floating out in the middle of the ocean. But the problem is this is causing impacts to our sea life, you know, our wildlife, marine wildlife. And we don't know all of the effects that it's going to have, but it is causing problems already. We're finding animals with lots of plastic in them, and you know, that's not good for them or our environment. So we need to stop it before it gets that far. We can do that in the landscape or in the roadways by picking it up before it gets into those stormwater drains. So plastic isn't the only problem that we deal with when we're talking about poor water quality. We also deal with animal waste, fertilizers, grass clippings. Grass clippings are a huge problem, and we're going to talk about that. Oil, grease, soil even, erosion can cause problems. We're in Florida, and our soils are full of phosphorus. That's why we have Mosaic in our backyard mining the phosphorus out, because we have lots of it in our soil. And so when that soil gets into the water, that's a nutrient. All it needs is a little nitrogen. Then that's what plants need to grow, are a little bit of nitrogen and phosphorus, and we can grow plants pretty well. So we'll grow algae pretty well in our ponds. So we've got to be careful with that erosion, try to prevent it as much as we can. And then other toxic chemicals, pesticides, can get into the water as well. So this is a little model of how it happens. So we got the rain cloud up there, and it's running down the roof, going down the gutter. That gutter, it's very common to see them directed right out onto the driveways, and that's not a good practice. We should direct them into the landscape, because if we direct it right out onto that concrete driveway, it runs down, it picks up all the gas and oil that may be sitting on that driveway and takes it where? Right into that storm drain. So we want to make sure that we're trying to keep our driveways clean, but also directing those downspouts into the landscape, because the landscape can utilize that water. You've got some pet waste there that's getting bacteria pushing into the water. We've got lawn runoff. If there's over fertilization in that landscape, it's going to push it into the stormwater drain, and then it drains out into the water there. You can see the little fish, who probably isn't so happy. Again, this is non-point source pollution. It comes from many sources, diverse sources, and it can be made up of a lot of different things like plastic, oil, nutrients, chemicals, all kinds of things. So what you do can really have some big impacts, because you're not just taking care of one landscape like a homeowner, you're taking care of many. Some of you take care of 40, 50 accounts in a week. So you can have some big impacts on helping us to curb some of this pollution. So the rest of the class is really going to talk more about what you do on a day-to-day basis and how you can help maybe curb some of the pollution heading into the waterways. So the next section, we're going to talk about irrigation. We're going to talk about, why do we really have irrigation, and what are the restrictions on it in Manatee County? What does frequency and duration mean? How do we calibrate those systems? We're going to talk about rain sensors, drought stress, and then looking for signs of overwatering. So in Florida, the average Floridian uses about 124 gallons of water per day. It's a lot of water. And if they have an outdoor irrigation system, the prediction is about 50% of their water use is going outdoors. So half of your water bill, if you get one from Manatee County and you have a irrigation system, half of it is the statistic that is being in our area. It's maybe a little better, so maybe 40% of your water bill is being used outside for irrigation for plants and turf. So is that necessary? Do we need to use that much water outside in the landscape? We're going to talk about that as we go through, but it's not necessary to water our yard with a fire hose. And I tell you what, I was riding my bike this past weekend. We had received about 7 inches of rain last week. And as I'm riding my bike on a Saturday morning, a lot of irrigation systems were running. They shouldn't have been. There should have been rain sensors preventing them from turning on, but they were running. We've got standing water in most of the county, and people are still running their irrigation systems. So we have a problem. We are definitely overwatering, and we need to fix that. So why do we irrigate? What's the whole purpose of an irrigation system? In Florida, and Manatee County specifically, we receive 52 inches of rain on average each year. 52 inches of rain. I'm going to tell you that 1 inch a week of water is all you need in your landscape to keep it surviving and healthy. 1 inch a week. So how many weeks are there in a year? There's 52 weeks in a year, and I just said that we get 52 inches of rain. So why do we need to irrigate? Well, it's all about the timing. We'll get 10 inches in one day, and then we won't see it for 4 months. So during that drought period, during that time of When we don't have any rain, we need some water to supplement the rainfall. And that's what irrigation is supposed to be. It fills in the gaps. It supplements rainfall. It's not something that it's supposed to run every single week because you have a system and you can. We need to really be careful with our water resources and protect our water resources. Not only that, it's not good for the landscape. When we're over irrigating the landscape, we're creating problems. If it grows too fast, it's going to get bugs. The bugs are going to come in because there's all that nice new tender growth. We can have fungus issues. When we have standing water around, we can have weed issues from overwatering. So we need to be very careful in how we're irrigating and making sure that we have systems in place that when we do get rain, our automatic irrigation system doesn't just come on. So when we're watering, what is the goal? When we do run our irrigation, what's the goal of that irrigation? Where do the plants need the water? Well, they need it at their root systems. They don't need it thrown all up on top of the plant. It really needs to be directed down towards the root system. So how deep does the water need to go? Well, that's going to depend on the type of plant that you have. I will say large established trees don't really need additional irrigation unless we're in a pretty severe drought. Their roots go deep enough that they can get into the water table sometimes, so they can access moisture that's pretty far down. So unless we're in a pretty severe drought, the larger established trees won't need irrigation. And on a weekly basis, the shrubs don't need irrigation. Their roots also go down deeper, so they don't need it every week. Again, when we start to head into a drought time, that's when shrubs would need some irrigation. But turf, you can see its root system only goes down about 6 inches. That dries out pretty quickly. That layer of soil dries out pretty quickly. So turf does need more water than shrubs and trees because its root system can't get down to the moisture. So where do we water? Well, we want to get just below the root zone. We want to encourage the roots to go deeper. If we water all the time, just a little bit, every day for just a little bit, the roots don't have to grow deep for their water sources. It's all up on the surface. So the plants will just keep their roots right up on the surface. So we want to water deep enough to go below the root zone. Manatee County has some water restrictions. We ask that you water, we're going to tell you that you cannot water more than twice a week. That's more than sufficient to keep a landscape healthy, twice a week. I can tell you that most times of the year, once a week is sufficient to keep your landscape healthy. But you can water twice a week according to our restrictions. You do not want to water after 10 a.m. in the morning or before 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Why don't we water during that time? Because it evaporates. The heat of the day, you put water out, it's just going to evaporate and not be utilized by the plants and their root systems. So we want to water in the late evening, early morning, through the night if we have to. I know some of your clients are on schedules in their communities and they have to water in the middle of the night. That's not ideal, but it's better than watering at noon. So even addresses, and when I say even addresses, I'm talking about the house number of the address. So the first numbers on the address, the last number of that number set. If it's an even number, they water on Thursday and Sunday. If it's an odd number, then they water on Wednesday and Saturday. If you have micro or low volume irrigation, there's not a limit on that. So we're only talking about spray heads and rotors that have the restrictions. If you put in a new landscape, you get a little waive on the restrictions for 60 days, but you do have to call the utilities department and let them know because they do have code enforcers out, and so they'll let them know so you don't get a ticket. There are no limits on recycled water fountains, and car washing or pressure washing right now. So this is our current water restriction. It's kind of in place year round now because we know that you don't need to water more than twice a week. Sometimes we go into a higher level of water restriction, so you need to stay aware of that. Sometimes we don't allow car washing and fountains water fountains in people's yards. So just keep aware of what the restrictions are. But currently, these are our restrictions, and they're in place year-round. So what's the difference between frequency and duration? Well, the frequency is how often you water. So do you water every day? You better not be, but we should only be watering once, possibly twice a week. That's the frequency. The duration is how long the system runs for. Does the zone run for 10 minutes? Does it run for 30 minutes? How do we determine how long we run those zones? How do you do it? I know a lot of you just say 30 minutes on spray heads and 60 minutes on rotors, right? That doesn't tell us if the right amount of water is going out. So how do you do it properly? Well, first let's talk about the frequency. And I said that once a week is probably sufficient. So you can see here in the spring, sometimes we have a really warm, dry spring, and we might need to put the irrigation, set it to run twice a week. Same with fall. Sometimes we have a very warm, dry fall, and we have to water twice a week to, keep the landscape going. But in the winter, it's cold. Those plants aren't growing. Sometimes they're not growing at all, and most of the time they're growing very slowly. So they don't need much water. And putting a lot of water out during the winter can actually cause fungus problems, so you don't want to do that. So during the winter, once a week. Actually, if it's very cool, every other week. We call it skip a week in the winter. And in the summer, we also talk about once a week. Why in the summer? It's the hottest time of the year, but it's also the wettest time of the year. This is summer is typically our rainy season. So if we're experiencing rain, sometimes you can even turn the controller off. And right now, since we got that 6-7 inches last week, I would say turn your controller off. But it's going to be dependent on what our rainfall has been. So when we're watering turf, again, we want to water infrequent. So once a week, maybe twice a week, and we want to water deeply past the root system so that the root system has to grow down to access that moisture. If we water every day, just a little bit, we'll have this type of shallow root system here, and that's not what we want, because then when we do go under a water restriction where we can't water, that's going to be the first lawn that dies. And what do you think your client's going to say when their neighbors have green turf and theirs is all brown? Who do you think they're going to come talk to? Okay, rain sensors or other rain shutoff devices. Now we have soil moisture sensors. We also have smart controllers that connect to weather stations. These are all good things, and they're all required by law. You have to have some type of rain shutoff device on your irrigation system. The problem is they often aren't functioning. We have a mobile irrigation lab that we go out and look at residents' irrigation systems, and when we test these rain sensors, we find only 37% of them are working. 37% on something that's the law and required. So we are definitely wasting a lot of water just because these aren't working properly. If you're in a company or if you do any irrigation work, this is a billable service. Why aren't you checking the rain sensors and replacing them? If you tell your homeowner that they have a rain sensor that is not functioning and they say that they don't care, they're not going to replace it, that's something that can be reported to the state. It's supposed to be reported to the state. I don't want to tell you to go scare your homeowners, but you might want to educate them that they are required to have a working rain shutoff device. So, if you're in that business, that is a billable service. Please do it. In this slide, we're showing a good location is open to the sky, so it receives rainfall. It's not in a place where it's getting a lot of water running on it. Sometimes those bend down and they're kind of hanging off of the roof a little bit. The water then just runs over top of them. That's not what we want to see. We want to see them up off of the roof and open to the sky. But what's the problem with the other one? Well, it's sitting under that eave, and unless we have sideways rain, which we get sometimes, it's not going to get wet. So that eave's going to block it from getting rainfall on it. I've seen them also on trees. We saw one in the middle of the yard where the irrigation was hitting it when it ran. So check out where these things are located. Another place that we find them are in bushes, and sometimes they get hit with the weed whacker or the shears when they're trimming the bushes. And so sometimes they can be like hanging off of the post. So in the turf grass, it's going to tell you when it needs water. Your landscape is going to tell you when it needs some water. So with turf grass, it gets the blue-gray look to it. When you walk across it and turn around and look back, you'll see footsteps where you walked. And the leaf blades are going to fold in half. We say they start praying for rain. So I'll show you, here's a nice, healthy, hydrated turf. And then we have dry turf. See the difference? Where those little black circles are, you can see leaf blades are all folded up. Back here again, nice, healthy, turf that's received a proper amount of water, and then dry turf. So sometimes you just want to wait and let your lawn tell you when it's time to water instead of just automatically running that system because we're wasting a lot of water out in the landscape. There's also plants in the landscape that we call them indicator plants. They'll tell you when it's dry. Thryallis is one that we have around our county a lot, and I say it's dramatic. It goes, and droops down, and as soon as you give it a little water, it perks right back up. So that's a good indicator plant. It's going to tell you when the landscape needs some water. Some plants, however, if you let them go that far, they're not coming back. So you need to know your plants before you just let them all droop. But let your landscape tell you when it's time to water. When we overwater, we encourage weeds. These are 3 weeds, pictures here, that are signs of overwatering. All 3 of these weeds are aquatic plants. So sedges, dollarweed, the doveweed there, and alligator weed are all aquatic plants. And when we have them in our landscape, we have too much water. Another thing that we need to help our clients out with, especially if you're doing irrigation work, is to do a check on that irrigation. It typically runs in the middle of the night, so the client doesn't know if it's broken. They don't see these geysers out in the landscape. So we want to check them for clogged heads, leaking sprinklers, sprinklers that are missing the nozzles on top because they've been mowed over or hit with weed eaters, pipes that are broken or leaking. This photo on, let's see if I can point over there, is a picture of a valve box out in the landscape. And it's full of water because there's a leaking valve. And you can see the valve in the other photo and the water coming out of it. So when those valves leak like that, there's just like a little ball valve inside of it. And sometimes it gets clogged or it just wears out over time and it starts to leak. So if you're maintaining somebody's yard and you see a puddle like this in their landscape around a valve box, you're going to want to tell them about that. If you're not the one who fixes the irrigation system, they're going to thank you because you're saving them money because that's water that they're paying for. Just being leaked away out there. Plus, it's creating problems in the landscape right there. There's going to be a mud hole there with probably weeds coming up and even fungus. So let your clients know when you see these things. Other fun things that we find when we go out and run irrigation systems, we've got heads that have been probably ran over or mowed over, and it happens. That's why we have to check our system, and we should check it more when the grass is growing because we're mowing more, we're out in the grass more doing maintenance, so there's more opportunity to have problems with the landscape heads. So during the summer months when the landscape's growing, we recommend that you check the system at least once a month. But the middle picture is something that we don't like to see. Sidewalk shouldn't be wet like that. The water needs to go out into the landscape. That sidewalk isn't going to use that water, and it should not be getting that water. That's just a waste right there. So make sure that the spray heads, the rotors, are directed into the landscape and not the roads, sidewalks, and driveways or sides of homes. I was at one lady's house, and the rotor was spraying all over her windows. And I'm thinking, you have to wash these windows all the time because somebody's not adjusting your irrigation head. So, help your clients out in that way. Another thing that happens quite a lot is the photo with the berm. You can see a brown spot in that berm, and that brown spot is because that one head is tilted. So as it makes its turn, it's directed down into the turf instead of out and up. So it's not hitting that area over there under the arc of the other irrigation head. So that berm is dry in that spot because it's not getting the irrigation that it needs. And it could have happened because it was run over by a mower or something. But this is why we need to check the irrigation system from time to time, because we develop these brown spots, and then y'all call me out there and say, I think there's fungus here. And the first thing I'm going to say is, let's look at the irrigation system, turn it on, let's see if it's got coverage. So that should be your first go-to as well. The other photo is, you can see there's a spray head under there, but the grass has grown over the head. So again, it's summer, grass is growing. The grass can grow over, especially St. Augustine, right over top of these heads. And when it tries to pop up, it can't because it's got that turf sitting right up on top of it. So you need to keep those heads clear so that the irrigation can work properly. Otherwise, this is just going to make a big water hole right there at that head, and the rest of the turf is going to be dry. So we all need to do our part to try to save water. It can improve the landscape health. It protects your client's investment, and that's important to them. So I talked earlier about, us being professional. These are ways that we can make this industry, have a more professional appearance, is by educating our clients to do the right things in their landscape, but also helping them with some of these things. Even though irrigation isn't your job, you don't do any irrigation work, when you see some of these things in the landscape, you need to tell your client about it. They will appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to move topics now and talk about landscape designs. So we're going to talk about our site conditions, our characteristics of our plant, and the number one rule in design. So as we are coming up with what types of plants we should put in the landscape, as we're deciding that, we want to know what the site conditions are in the landscape. Is it shady? You don't want to put a full sun plant in shade. And you definitely don't want to put a full shade plant in the sun, or it's going to be very dramatic, Whoa. So you need to know your site conditions. Then you need to know your plant's characteristics, and you need to match those two together. And when you do that, it's called putting the right plant in the right place. And we want to do that every time. If you don't know how to do that, then you need to call somebody that does. We can help you with that. The Extension Service has lots of resources that we can help you with that. So if you want to learn how to do that, come talk to us. Otherwise, call someone who knows how to do that. Because if you put a bunch of plants into a client's landscape and they are not the right plant for the right place, they're going to have nothing but problems, and they won't think kindly of you. So we want to think about things in the site conditions like our pH. What's the pH of the soil? There's a very common plant that gets utilized in the landscape. It's called Ixora. Little red flowers, usually up at the front of the house, around the pools. They're everywhere in Manatee County. Ixoras don't do well in Manatee County. They always have a leaf spot on them. Why? Because they like a very low pH, an acidic soil. That's what they like. What do we have? We have high pHs typically. We have more alkaline soils. And so they're not in the right place and they struggle. I don't know why we continue to use them so much in Manatee County, but we do. We need to stop that. Or there is a way that you can kind of trick them, but it causes more chemical to be applied and more maintenance to be applied. So save yourself some time and some money and look for those plants that are adapted and fit that place in the landscape. That'll save you a lot of work. The other thing that's really important is looking at the mature height and spread of these plants. Let's talk about oak trees. That's my pet peeve right now. We have lots that are only 40 foot wide, only 40 feet from one line to the other in these new communities. And we're putting oak trees on every lot. Do you know what the spread on an oak tree is? 120 feet. On a 40-foot lot, and another 40-foot lot, and another 40-foot lot. And then we wonder why we have problems with all of our landscapes and our driveways and sidewalks being uprooted. We're not giving these trees enough space. We need to find the appropriate plant for those kinds of conditions. So we need to look at the height and spread before we put the plant in. Another thing that we do a lot in landscape design is in front of the window or right by the front door, we'll put a hibiscus. And hibiscus, when you buy it in a 3-gallon pot, you know, it's only this big. It's not that big, but it wants to be 15 feet tall. So when we put it in front of a window that's only 3 or 4 feet off the ground, we're constantly going to have to prune it to keep it from blocking the window. Why not look for a plant that only wants to be 3 or 4 foot tall to put there? Then we reduce our pruning maintenance. Makes sense to me. Other things that we want to look at are our moisture. Is it wet? Is it dry? The salt. Manatee County has lots of issues with salt. If they're under reclaimed water, the salts are higher in reclaimed water. So we always use salt-tolerant plants if you have a client that has reclaimed water for irrigation. If they have a well, we have lots of saltwater intrusion in Manatee County. So there again, if they have a well, even if they don't have saltwater intrusion today, I would use salt-tolerant plants in their landscape because there's always the possibility that it's coming. So rather than them have to redo their whole landscape, if that happens, they're already prepared for it. So what are the plant's needs? You know, that's, again, we want to match those plants' needs to the site conditions. So know what each of those are and then find the ones that fit together. And when we do that, that's putting the right plant in the right place. So as a result, you're going to have a healthier, happier landscape, and you'll have a lot less problems, a lot less maintenance, and you won't have to use as much pesticide and fertilizer in that landscape. So here's some examples of the wrong plant in the wrong place. I'm not sure why that turf is in the middle of that landscape bed. Now that turf has to be, mowed, but they probably use a string trimmer, and irrigated differently than the rest of that landscape bed. I don't know what they were thinking when they did that, but now they've increased their maintenance. What about this? This happens all the time. A lot of people say, oh, the trees were there before the power lines. Not in this case. So before we ever plant trees, what should we do? Look up. Don't plant trees under power lines. FPL has a really great website right here, and it shows you the clearance and the setbacks. So before you start planting trees around power lines, you should check this website out and see how far back you should plant trees. If you're going to plant a large tree, you need to come off of the power line 50 feet. That's some folks' whole front yard. So it may not be appropriate to put a large tree in their front yard if they have a power line going across the front of it. You may just need to use medium or the smaller trees in that landscape. I'm going to go back for just a second because a lot of us complain about the cuts on these trees, and I agree it's not a good cut, and if you're an arborist you kind of twinge a little when you see that, but that's not their job. Their job is not to come out and trim that tree appropriately. Their job is to come out and clear the lines. And we like our air conditioning in the summer, and we don't want a small little windstorm to blow branches into those power lines and discontinue our power in the summer. So that's why they keep those lines clear, is for us. So don't blame the power company. They're doing their job in keeping these lines clear. We need to look at ourselves and where we're planting the trees and how we're maintaining these trees. So encourage your clients if they have, this situation that maybe that tree isn't in the right place and maybe they need to think about removing it and putting another tree in elsewhere. Here's another great example of the wrong plant in the wrong place. So this is a cardboard palm. Cardboard palms want to be about 12 foot tall and about 12 foot wide. From the wall to that bus stop bench, do you think that it's 12 feet? No, it's maybe 4 feet. The other great thing about this plant is it has like a saw on the ends of the leaves. It will cut you. It's a very rigid leaf with a saw on the end of it, and it will really cut you. So why would they put a plant that can cut you right at a bus stop without enough space for it to grow? So wrong plant, wrong place. Find a place. It's a great plant. It's a beautiful plant, but it needs space. So find a place that it can be healthy in. Okay, we're going to go into our fertilizer BMPs now and talk about fertilization. And I realize you're sitting in this class because you don't apply fertilizer, but it's important for you to understand a little bit about fertilizer. So we're not going to go into too much depth here, but I want you to just understand a few things about fertilization. And maybe in the future you will be a fertilizer applicator and you can understand it a little more. So first thing to know is, in order to apply fertilizer in Florida, you have to have the Green Industries Best Management Practices class, which is a full day class. It's about 8 hours. And then you take a test, an exam, and you have to pass that exam. And once you do that, then you're eligible to get a license in the state of Florida to apply fertilizer. That's only fertilizer though. You need a different license to apply pesticide. So in order to apply a weed and feed product, you need both a fertilizer license and a pesticide license. Okay, so that everybody understands that. But we don't put down fertilizer just to put down fertilizer. It's expensive, and we don't want to incur that expense unless we need to. So don't fertilize without a reason. Make sure you understand your fertilizer labels and ordinances. Pick the right fertilizer to do the job, and always calibrate your spreader. So there's 3 main important ingredients in a bag of fertilizer, and that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We call it the NPK, which is a kind of a nickname for what is the analysis, those numbers. 1608 is the analysis of a particular bag of fertilizer. What does that mean? Well, that means that there's 16% nitrogen in the bag, there's no phosphorus, and there's 8% potassium in that bag. That's what those numbers mean. It's a percentage of what's in the bag. Why is there no phosphorus? Well, in Manatee County, you're not allowed to apply phosphorus. Remember I said Mosaic mines for phosphorus in Manatee County because we already have it in our soils. That's why we don't allow phosphorus applications. You can do a soil test, and if the homeowner shows a deficiency in phosphorus, you can put that on file with the county administrator. Then you can apply phosphorus to that landscape, but only if you have a fertilizer license. So what I want you to know though are the 3 important ingredients in a fertilizer bag are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. NPK. Deflector shields are required in Manatee County. That is that little white thing under the hopper there. It keeps the little prills or granules from going out onto hard surfaces. So when you're fertilizing next to a hard surface, you flip that deflector shield around. Some fertilizer spreaders have a little bar that you adjust, and that closes some of the holes down. But however you need to do that, there's a way to adjust it. Hopefully there has to be, according to our ordinance, that reduces those prills from getting onto hard surfaces. You are required to keep fertilizer 10 feet away from bodies of water, 10 feet away. Clean up any spills. We do have a blackout period, and this is important for you to know. The blackout period means you cannot apply nitrogen. No nitrogen from June 1st until September 30th. Remember those dates, June 1st to September 30th. You are not allowed to apply nitrogen. It is our restricted season or blackout period. Once you do put down fertilizer, it typically needs a little water to get it activated, to get it to start to break down. So most fertilizer applications need a little bit of water. So I told you we were going to be brief about fertilizer. That's really all you need to know, unless you want to become a licensed applicator, and then come see us and we'll help you with that. We're going to talk about mulch because this is something you guys work a lot with. So we're going to define what it is, why we mulch, know how to do it correctly. So what is mulch? Well, it's typically an organic type of material that can break down and improve the soil. So we want those types of products that will break down and improve the soil. There's some things out there like rubber mulch and rocks. Those can be utilized in the landscape, but not under the plants. Mulch actually helps keep moisture down in that root ball, so it can benefit the plant by holding the moisture in. If we have rocks actually heat up and can pull moisture out of the soil. So we wouldn't want to use rocks under the plants in that root ball area. Rocks can be used for paths or decorative features, but just not under the plants. So we definitely want to use those wood type mulches that can break down. What are the benefits of mulch? Well, it helps reduce weeds. I think it just makes it more visible for you to see the weeds and get them out easier. Weed seeds blow in. Sometimes you guys know you deal with it. Sometimes there can be a lot of weeds in mulch, but it makes it easier to pull because they're not in soil. They're in a looser medium for you to be able to pull them out. It slows water loss because it acts like a little insulation blanket and keeps moisture in the soil. It can improve the appearance. Everybody loves when their landscape's just been mulched. It freshens it up and makes it look nice. And it can also help with soil temperature. When the temperature is really super hot during one day, that mulch is like a blanket, keeping the temperature a little lower in the soil. Same is true in the winter. When we have really cold nights, that mulch can help hold heat down in the soil and help keep the root system a little warmer, which can benefit the plant. So the organic types of mulches, they break down and put organic material back into the soil. That's a good thing. Plants can use that organic material. Another reason that we can mulch is to help to protect our trees. This poor little tree in this picture, it's been whacked with a weed eater several times and now it's got a scar. Great place for insects and fungus to set in. So put a little mulch around those trees so we don't have to get the weed eaters that close. Or the mowers. I've seen mowers do that as well. We don't want to mulch too deep. We create these things called mulch volcanoes, and I know what you guys do. It's laziness. We go out and it only needs about a half a bag of mulch out under that tree, and we just dump the whole bag because we don't want to carry the half a bag back. I know, I've seen it done, and over time that full bag of mulch builds up, and then we have this volcano that looks like this with a tree poking out through the middle of it. And that's going to cause a lot of problems for the tree. It can cause the trunk to rot. It cuts off the water and the oxygen that gets down into the roots. Root systems of plants need water and oxygen. Just like you need water and oxygen, so do they. And when we put, this much mulch on top of them, it blocks that from them. I've actually seen it where the trees will set all of their roots into these mulch volcanoes. And then when that happens, we have roots on top of the ground. Is that tree going to be secure? Absolutely not. So in that case, the recommendation is to remove the tree and put in another one. So this is really a poor practice. No mulch volcanoes. We don't want to mulch too close to the base of plants either. If we get that mulch piled up at the base, it's the same thing. We want to kind of pull it away. It's real easy when we're, putting that bag down, it just kind of flows up under things sometimes to walk away from it. You shouldn't do that. Be the professional. Come back. Fix it. If we've got too much mulch piled up under those plants, it can kill the plant, definitely cause them to decline. So how deep do we want to mulch? Well, when you first put it down, it's going to be fluffy, right? With a little air in it. But after it settles, then you only want it about 2 to 3 foot deep. We want to keep it about 6 inches away from trees and shrubs. And we want to use that organic mulch to improve the soil. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about mowing. This is something you should be very familiar with. So did you know that turf can actually help reduce some of our pollution? We're also going to talk about the mowing heights for turf. It's really important that we mow our turf at the right height and why our blades need to be sharp. So let's go over some of those things. When we're mowing, something that can happen is we can get thatch. and I'm going to show you what thatch is, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I've been in landscapes before where I've stepped into the yard and my shoe is like covered up. The turf just swallows my shoe. That's thatch. There's too much thatch in the yard. And there's ways that we can reduce that. We don't want to mow wet grass, and we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about no-mow zones too. So how does turf help reduce pollution? Well, turf can slow stormwater down. Look at that little, that's really a dry pond there. But think about the water flowing off of the banks of that pond, those slopes. If there wasn't any turf there, if it was just soil, what would happen? It would take the soil with it, right? When it rains, and it's going to move that water and move that soil. So it's going to erode the side of that dry bank or that dry pond. So the turf, the root systems are going to help hold it in place. So when it does that, it also has all those little turf blades that the water flows through. So it slows it down. And when it's slowing it down, it's also filtering it, helping to remove some of the pollutants out of it. So turf can, really be a great asset for us because it does those things. It can slow down stormwater. It can filter pollutants, thereby reducing erosion and protecting our groundwater. But when the turf is wet, we don't want to cut it. Now, I know you guys always laugh at me. It's Florida in the summer. When is the turf not wet? I get it. But we're always talking about the best maintenance practices here, right? These are the best management practices. So in the best maintenance conditions, we don't want to cut wet turf. Why? Because it doesn't cut even. If there's any kind of disease, fungus, it can really help spread it around because now the turf is wet and it's going to move it to the rest of the landscape as well. You're going to get those big clumps of turf. It's going to mat up and clump. And I've been called out before to look at landscapes where the turf had all these little brown spots in it, and the folks thought that it was a fungus, and it was just, there were clumps of grass clippings, and the sun can't get through that. And so it causes these little brown spots all over the landscape when you do that. So if you do have to mow wet turf, make sure you're not leaving those clumps behind, because your homeowner's not going to be happy about that when they have those little brown spots everywhere. But mowing wet turf also wears your blades out a lot faster, and it's hard to blow those clippings back into the turf when they're wet, right? I know you've done it. Okay, we want to keep those mower blades nice and sharp. You can see here, this is some frayed edge turf. Think about yourself. If you were to cut your hand and you cut it in a straight line, when you put a Band-Aid on it, it's going to heal pretty quickly because those two straight lines are going to touch back together. Now, if you cut in a zigzag, it's going to take that a lot longer to heal because it's not a straight cut. It's the same with the turf. If we cut with a nice sharp blade, the turf can recover from that much easier than these jagged edges. Not only that, but when the homeowner comes home from a long day of work and they look at this wonderful mowing job that you completed for them and it has that brown haze all over it from jagged edges, they're not going to be happy. So make sure you have nice sharp mower blades. It's going to be healthier for the turf because they can recover easier, and it's going to keep you in business because you'll have happy homeowners. What do we do with the clippings? I don't ever want to see you guys leaving the clippings like the bottom photo there. Don't ever do that. You will get a ticket. It's $100 in Manatee County if you leave grass clippings like that. Why? Well, where do we put the fertilizer? We put fertilizer in the grass and in the landscape beds. Why? Because the grass uses it. So the grass is taking up the fertilizer, right? So in each blade of grass, we have what? The three things, NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So in each turf blade, we have fertilizer essentially. And so all those little grass clippings laying there are like little bits of fertilizer. And see that storm drain? As soon as it rains, where are all those grass clippings going? Into the drain, straight into the pond, no filter, no anything. If this is out on the island, it's going straight into the Gulf of Mexico. No filter, no anything. All that fertilizer or grass clippings, which are, to me, little bits of fertilizer. So we want to make sure we're blowing those back blowing them back into the turf, because then they can recycle those nutrients. It can utilize those nutrients from the grass clippings back in the grass. Let the nutrients recycle right there. Plus it puts some organic material back into the soil, which is a good thing. So make sure you're blowing back your grass clippings. Now, if you work for one of these big companies, I've seen where they'll mow like all the way through the main road of a community. And some of these main roads are 5 miles long. And they'll mow all the way down, and then they'll get a tractor with a blower on the back of it to blow the grass clippings back. Well, that can be a problem too, because it's summer, it's rainy season. So you start mowing and you get 2 miles in and it starts raining. Now all those grass clippings are going to head to the stormwater drain, the catchment drain there in the road. So we'll have a problem. So instead of mowing the whole 5 miles and coming back and blowing it back, maybe get somebody on a tractor behind you blowing as you mow. But don't leave it for that long. Again, if there's nobody around and grass clippings are left, the code enforcement can fine you for that. Don't leave grass on the streets. Never leave them around stormwater drains or bodies of water. The fine can go up to $500. First offense is $100, but it can go up to $500. So don't do that, okay? And these are actual photos. These are not staged. We go out and look at things, and this is how it's left sometimes. I go out and do water testing in stormwater ponds. We've been out where we couldn't even get a clean water test because there were so many grass clippings on top of the pond that we couldn't get a good clean sample. Why? Because of this situation. It rains and all those grass clippings go into the pond. Then we have fertilizer, little bits of fertilizer in our ponds. So thatch. Thatch happens mostly in St. Augustine, and the reason that it happens is because St. Augustine grows like this, right? It has these stolons that it shoots these runners out, and that's good. We like it to grow that way. And as it does so, it grows on top of itself, and there's always going to be a little bit of dead turf underneath. It's decomposing, it's fine. But when we force our St. Augustine to grow too quickly by using too much fertilizer and too much water, forcing that growth, it starts growing on top of each other, and now we have, this much turf growing and not much decomposing down at the bottom. So all of this live growth up here doesn't have any place to put its roots. So the roots are on top of live turf and not into soil. So it dries out a lot quicker. It gets scalped easily, because when you get in it with a mower, your tires sink down and you scalp it when you're mowing it. It's not a healthy situation for the turf. So we need to cut back on fertilizer, cut back on water when we have those situations. Otherwise, sometimes we have to go in and restore the landscape using processes that can really tear it up for a while, and homeowners usually aren't too happy with that. So here's a picture of normal thatch. You always are going to have a little bit of normal thatch, and that's where those microorganisms are in there, decomposing things, doing a good job out in the landscape. But when we get too much of that, then we start to have problems. So again, reduce fertilizer and water to help with that. Turf does not grow in the shade. I don't care what the turf sales guy tells you, it does not grow in dense shade. Turf needs at least 6 hours of sunlight to grow. There are some varieties that can tolerate a little bit of shade, but that's not what's pictured here, which is dense shade. If you have that situation, you need to have a mulch bed, you need to have a landscape bed, you need to do something else, because turf isn't going to grow. It's always going to be a problem with fungus. It just can't grow there. So if the homeowner insists that turf be in that situation, then you need to trim out some of those branches so more light can get in. You need to make sure you're mowing at the highest height that you can. Not a lot of irrigation, because it's not going to get dry down there. It's going to be shaded all the time. So you need to really go light on your irrigation and make sure, that's not the place where the golf carts and all are running through. So mowing height is very important on turf. The higher the shoot or the blade, the deeper the root. And that's what this picture is showing. So you can see that the longer the blade, the longer the root. And we want long roots. We want healthy root systems. So we want to mow that turf as high as we can, not only for the root system, but sometimes we can actually shade out weed seeds by having the turf nice and tall. So it can combat some of the weeds just by being a little taller. So when we're talking about bahia, I doubt many of you maintain too much bahia, but if you do, 3 to 4 inches is where we want to cut. And that is the blade height. That is not looking at roots. That's not looking at the little V where it starts to grow. I'm talking about the blade. The blade height needs to be 3 to 4 inches. St. Augustine, 4 inches. You can even go a little higher on St. Augustine, but at least 4 inches. You'll find you'll have much stronger, healthier St. Augustine if you mow it higher. There are some dwarf varieties of St. Augustine that could be mowed a little bit lower, 2.5 to 3 inches. And then zoysia, which is very popular out there, zoysia is 2 to 2.5 inches. So we mow it lower. The problem can be when you guys are going from one job to another and you have St. Augustine on one site and then you go to another and it's zoysia. You need to make sure you're lowering that deck for the zoysia and then raising it back up for the St. Augustine. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the different species and their benefits and disadvantages. So St. Augustine, it's a pretty tolerant species of turf. It can tolerate shade and salt, but not dense shade, right? And not a lot of salt. It can tolerate a little bit of each of them. It has a very wide span for the pH. So it can grow in a little acidic soil, it can grow in a little alkaline soil, and all in between. It establishes from sod or plugs. We cannot get St. Augustine to establish from seed. I don't know if in other places that they can, but in Florida we can't. So you need to either buy sod or plugs or even runners. If some people, will trim it out of what's running into their landscape bed and stick it in bare spots out in the yard to get it going. The disadvantages of St. Augustine, it does like its water. It does need a little bit more water than some of the other varieties like bahia. It requires fertilization to be healthy in most cases. It doesn't wear well. So if it's the place that the golf cart's driving or, maintenance guys for pond or whatever's coming in with those gators and stuff, it doesn't wear well. It can get thatch if we're forcing it with too much water and fertilizer. It's one that really can get thatch. And then it can get chinch bugs as well. And we've had some problems with chinch bugs in the past because they were resistant to our pesticides, and we just had neighborhoods full of dead grass because of chinch bugs. So that's St. Augustine. The next largest species used in Manatee County is the Empire zoysia. So it was sold because everybody said it required less water. When it first came out on the market, everybody was saying, oh, it doesn't need as much water as any other turf species. Well, UF-IFAS research says that's not true. So at first, when it's establishing, it may not need as much water, but over time, it needs just as much water as any other turf species. So, it has some advantages, but it also has disadvantages, as do all of these turf varieties, right? There isn't a perfect turf, and don't tell me synthetic turf or artificial turf because that's worse than any of them. And why is that? Because it heats up really hot. And secondly, what do you do after 8 to 10 years when it breaks down in our landscape? It all goes into the landfill. So we definitely don't promote artificial turf. We just say, you know what? It's nature, it's landscape, it's going to have problems, and you guys get paid to deal with it, right? So Empire zoysia, it's more compact. It looks more like a golf course grass. It's got a little thin blade. It doesn't require as much fertilization or nitrogen, especially, than St. Augustine. Okay, so that is one benefit of zoysia, and we found through research that you can really cut that rate. So zoysia also has some disadvantages. It does not tolerate shade very well at all, so it really needs the full sun, at least 6 hours of sunlight. It also has its own little pest called the hunting bill bug. Now, we don't tend to find them too much in Manatee County, but in northern Florida they can be a real problem. I talked about the brown patch already over nitrogen applications. If we put too much nitrogen down, then we can get brown patch. And it's best to use a real mower instead of a fictitious mower. Yeah, ha ha ha. No. So we typically use a rotary mower when we're mowing, and zoysia responds better to a real mower, the kind that goes around and around like the golf courses use. But again, from research, we found that it does use the same amount of water as St. Augustine. So don't let people try to fool you and say, oh, it's, much more green and better for the environment because it doesn't use as much water. That's not true, unfortunately. Bahia. Bahia has its advantages. It doesn't require much fertilization at all, if at any. I actually have Bahia in my yard at home, and we don't fertilize. Don't tell anybody. But we don't do much to our landscape. It's a very low maintenance turf species. It's tolerant of sandy soils, but it does go dormant in the winter, and that's typically why the homeowners around here don't like it, because a lot of them are only here during the winter. So they don't want a turf variety that's going to be dormant during the time that they're here. So they would rather see St. Augustine. Zoysia also goes dormant in the winter. It will turn brown during the cold winter, and then it greens back up when the rains come along. Bahia has some disadvantages. It produces those seed heads, which homeowners don't like to see. And they can be a little rough on your mower blades sometimes too. It's not very wear tolerant. And it doesn't tolerate salts at all. So if you have saltwater intrusion or reclaimed water, sometimes it can be a problem for that. Okay, so looking at the turf varieties and the type of shade they'll tolerate, you can see Bermuda, Seashore paspalum. Those two species aren't really highly utilized in Manatee County. Neither is the centipede. You may come across it from time to time, but if so, just know that it needs full sun. It's not going to do well in any shade at all. The St. Augustine and the zoysia, you can see just, maybe a little bit of shade, and then our dwarf species can tolerate a little bit more shade. But for the most part, the turf species really do need a good amount of sun. So as a part of our fertilizer ordinance, we have what's called a no-mow zone. Well, they're calling it now a low maintenance zone, but it basically is a no-mow zone. They don't want mowers within 6 feet of stormwater ponds. So why? Well, remember those grass clippings I was talking about? If you're mowing right up to the pond edge, all those grass clippings are going in the water essentially, even if you don't blow them in the water, which you better not. That'll get you a $100 ticket. Even if you're just, have a mulching deck and it's staying right there on site, or you're blowing them the other way, they still end up in the water. It rains, the wind blows, they get in the water. So we'd like to see plants in this area. These planted shorelines is what we'd really like to see, because it keeps turf from getting, those grass clippings from getting in the water. Number one, you're not mowing that close to the water's edge, and number two, the turf that's behind the plants, when you mow it gets caught in those landscape beds. So those landscape beds act as a filter for the stormwater pond, which is a big benefit. But here is why I promote the 6-foot no-mow zone. How many of you have put a mower in a pond? You've slid in, you've flipped in. If you're saying no, you're probably lying, because most of you have put a mower in a pond. There's too many ponds and too many of you mowing. So what happens is the turf is at the water's edge like this. And the water, just a little bit of breeze starts hitting that turf, and it does what we call undercuts it. So it's washing out all of the soil underneath it. And you don't know because you see turf up here and you hit it with your mower tire and there's a pocket down here. And that'll either slide your mower into the pond or flip it into the pond. It can be very dangerous for you guys. We actually lost a gentleman in Manatee County several years ago who flipped into a pond and got pinned underneath his mower. And he died. So we don't want you guys up next to these pond edges. We want to keep you away from the pond edges. So encourage the homeowners association, if you're ever talking with them, to do these kinds of plantings. We have lots of resources that can help them. We're doing lots of research actually in Manatee County on stormwater ponds. So we're about halfway through our presentation. So if you're watching this on your own, now's a good time to pause for a minute and get a drink or use the restroom and then come back and join us. So I'm going to give just a second for you to do that. Okay, our next module is the installation best management practices, where we're going to talk about how to install trees and shrubs and looking at their root systems and learning the best practices of doing this. So when we're installing plants, of course you're going to dig a hole. You might slit the sides of the root ball. You're going to position the root ball back at little above soil level and backfill, removing air pockets, stake the trees, and then remove the stakes after a period of time. And we're going to go through each of these steps, don't worry. All right, so when we're installing a tree, you want to dig your hole twice as big as the root ball. Why? I know you guys think if you just make a nice tight hole that when you put that root ball in, it's not going to blow in the wind, right? And so it'll be better for the tree. You won't even have to stake it because you got your hole nice and tight. Well, that's not good for the root system, because now you're putting these roots in and they try to grow out and they can't because the soil's compact and hard. And those are just little baby feeder roots coming off at first and they can't get out into that soil. So for them to better establish in the soil, you need to loosen it for them. So twice as big as the root ball you want to go out. All right. Twice as much. Then you want to set the tree, the root ball, so that it's 10%. So 10% of the root ball needs to be above soil level. So you can see here that bottom line, that is soil level, and the root ball is up higher than that above. Why do we do that? What do we always put down at the root balls of trees? Mulch. So if we're putting the tree down at soil level and then we're putting mulch back on top of it, we're in a sense burying the tree. Not only that, but then it settles down over time. And so Dr. Ed Gilman was a researcher at UF. He's retired now, and he did some great research that showed that this is the best place to get your tree established because of the root systems making it stronger. So he had some money after the 3 crisscrossing hurricanes that came through Florida. They wanted to find out, the best place to, or the best practices of installing trees. So he put them below soil level, way above soil level, at soil level, and let them grow in and get established. And then he had this big fan with a generator that would simulate Hurricane 4 winds, hurricane level 4 winds, and he would bring it down the aisles of the field and blow the trees, and we'd all stand out there and watch trees blow down or trees stay standing. And we found through that research that this is the proper way to do it. More trees stayed standing if we left the root ball up 10%. The roots would grow down instead of growing up to try to get light and air. So there's a root ball. There it is above soil level. We're going to come back and mulch that, and that's also going to settle down. So after you set the tree in place, you're going to want to water it in, and you're going to, if you can, get one of those pipes, put it on the end of your hose so you can poke it down into the soil, and that will collapse the air pockets that are in there. A lot of times, there's big air pockets down there, and you water and it's a bubble, so it just stays there. So if you can kind of poke into it, it'll collapse all those air pockets. Now you don't want to stomp around on top of the root system. That's going to crush the roots. I've seen people do that. You just want to backfill it, tap it in, use the hose, try to get rid of the air pockets, but don't, stand and jump on it to try to get it in there. Then after you've done that, you're going to create that berm around the tree. So why do we create the berm? So we can water into it without the water all running off. So you want to create that berm around the root ball. And then you can water in, and the water will, slowly get down into the root ball. Another thing I want to point out is the root flare. So when you were a kid and you drew landscapes, how did you draw your trees? Did you draw 2 straight lines going right into the soil? Probably not. Most of us drew our trees coming out a little bit. That's the root flare, the top of the root system. And that needs to be out. They should be out. We were doing the right thing as kids. And now we're putting our plants in the ground and we're planting them too deep. So now it is 2 sticks going into the ground. We need to make sure that that top of that root system, that root flare, is out and exposed. I've been on sites where trees are failing, they're declining, and I've dug down 6 inches into mulch before I found that root flare. So that's a big problem that we have. We're installing our trees way too deep. We need to get them up so that they can get the air and the water that they need. So you can see here there's some shrubs that have been installed, and then there's dead spots. So we get called out all the time for things like this. And what's wrong with these shrubs? So we kind of go through, we put a detective hat on and go through a bunch of different scenarios. Is it irrigation? Is it pests? Is it fungus? And we couldn't figure out what was going on. So we finally pulled the plants out of the ground, and we found air pockets, big old air pockets down under the plants. So that's what happened. The roots will not grow into the air. When they hit that air pocket, the root stops growing. And so when it's trying to establish, if it keeps hitting air pockets, it's going to just fade. So these weren't properly watered in, and the air pockets killed the root systems. So here's that root flare again. It's really important that we can see the top of that root flare. You can see that one tree is not planted high enough because we can't see the flare. We want to really be able to see the top of those root systems so we know that they can get the water and the air that they need. If you pull a tree out of a pot, or typically it's going to happen in a pot and not a B&B, and you see root systems that look like this, put it back. If you can, put it back, because once root systems start circling when they're growing, once they start growing in a circle, they don't ever stop growing in a circle. You have to cut the root in order for it to stop. And what will happen is, as you can see in the picture right up here, that it will girdle the tree. It'll start to grow around the trunk of the tree, and then it grows. Over time, that root grows, and it grows into the tree and strangles it. So sometimes you can cut those away, and it can help the tree out, but sometimes you can't because they're too big a root system, and if you cut it, it's going to kill the tree anyway. So you want to make sure that you're not buying plants that are real root bound or have girdling roots. If it is a small shrub in a pot, you can cut into those root systems, using tools like this, and cut into the root system to stop those circling roots. And then when you plant it, you kind of fan out the roots a little bit at the bottom. You make an X at the bottom and kind of fan it out a little bit and plant it, and it'll grow a lot better for you. So when you plant your trees, because we're making our root balls twice the size, or our holes twice the size of the root ball, we're going to need to stake the trees so that they, stay upright and the roots don't get snapped all the time in the wind. There's lots of ways to stake the trees. Here's 3 examples of how to stake trees. That's not what I'm talking about here, but what I do want to make sure you understand is after 1 year, those stakes and all the support materials need to be removed. Okay, after 1 year, the tree should be established and all of that needs to be removed. And if it's not, it can grow into the tree. The tree will grow around it. And we see that happen a lot too. I've seen the little bands up on the branches that the ties were tied into left on the tree, and then the tree's grown around it, and it eventually girdles and the limb dies. I've seen down at the base, some staking stuff down at the base of the trees, some of the cloth straps and stuff where the tree's grown around it and we can't get it out. So, it's too late at that point. And it can kill the tree over time. So make sure all your strapping material is taken off the tree after 1 year. When you're installing a palm tree, you also need to stake it, but palm trees are different than hardwood trees. Palm tree trunks will never heal from damage, so you cannot nail your supports right into the palm tree trunk. If you do, it will never heal and it will be a hole that insects and fungus can get in. So you want to, just like in the photos, they've taken 2x4s and banded them around the tree. In the bottom photo, they've actually even put burlap on the tree to keep the 2x4s from damaging the tree. So they band them onto the tree so that the support 2x4s can be nailed into those so that the nails don't go into the trunk. So you should never climb palm trees with stakes to trim them, stakes on your shoes, and you should never nail into them. Okay, let's talk about pruning, because I know you guys do a lot of that too. So when we're pruning, we better have an objective to prune. Don't just go cutting plants because it's the 12th of the month or the 3rd month of the contract and you have to prune. There needs to be a reason to prune. We're going to talk about how to prune palms and how to direct growth with our pruning. So with plants, when they're growing, there is that terminal bud, and that's where most of your new growth is going to come from. And then we have our lateral buds, which, sometimes you have the little branching that comes off to the side. But the most active is that terminal bud. That's where most of the energy goes for the plant, and it puts the the energy into new growth right there. So if you're trying to direct that plant, let's say you get a real leggy plant, you can direct the growth of that by pruning that terminal bud. And when you take that terminal bud off, you're taking that energy, it's putting all of its energy there, and now it's going to put the energy more in those lateral buds, which can help it fill out. So if you've got those leggy plants, by pruning across the top, sometimes you can encourage them to fill in. Sometimes we want to train the plant to grow a certain direction, and we can do that by looking at those lateral buds and making a cut right above it. So we know then that that plant's going to go off and grow that direction because we've cut above that bud. So again, we can look at where the buds are and direct the growth. Snowbush tends to want to grow tall and leggy, or grow out. Sometimes it grows out over our sidewalks. So in this case, it's growing out, and we can cut it and it will put the energy into that bud that's headed up. So then it would fill in more growing up instead of out. When we're making these cuts, we want to make sure that we cut just a little bit at an angle, because when it rains, we want the water to fall off of it. We don't want the water to pool on it. So just a little bit of an angle above the bud. If we cut too deeply, like in B, we actually get into, the cambium and all, which is going to get into the bud's not going to get the nutrients that it needs to grow, because you've gotten into the food support network there. C, you've gone a little too far away from the bud, and you might encourage other growth by doing that. And D is too close to the bud. So when we're hedging our shrubs, this is very common. We just go across with the hedger and cut the top of it. But what that does is it encourages all that growth and activity right there where we've made those cuts. So we end up with this after picture of a very leggy type of shrub when we do that. So a better way to do that would be to come in and cut randomly. Now, it's more time. I realize that. It's not a hedge trimmer, it's using a pair of nippers and coming in and pruning it so it has a more natural look. But you can see the bottom shrub is much fuller than the top shrub because the growth is all from within and not just at the top. I have a landscape company that I work with that every person in the company has a pair of pruners on their belt. And whenever they're maintaining in the landscape, if they see something, they prune it. Everybody, the mower, the blower, everyone's trained to prune. So they all prune. So they don't go in every 3 months and do a mass pruning. The company owner feels that when you do that, you hedge, which isn't a great practice for the plant, and then all of those trimmings fall to the ground and you rake them up. What else are you raking up with them? Mulch, because they're in the mulch bed. So now you're taking away the mulch that you want to have there, and pruning and not the best practice for the plant. So if we could get away from hedging, especially in certain areas, I realize sometimes that's what the client wants. They pay the bills. That's what you're going to do. But if we can educate our clients as to why we would do it other ways, we can have fuller plants, more airflow through the plants, which can create less pest pressure sometimes. It's just a better practice to use. The other thing when we're hedging, with the hedgers, we're cutting straight across the top, or we're coming straight up the sides when we're trying to trim off the sidewalks and driveways. Again, we're keeping all of that new growth right at the top and right at the sides. And so it's shading all the underneath. And you can see in the shrub and bee, there's no growth down at the legs, right? So you have a leggy shrub, where if we would just angle those cuts a little bit, then we let light all the way down into the bottom, and then we'll get growth down there because there's light going down there. So just the way that you trim, if you can just angle a little bit, sometimes you can help fill the plants out and make them look better. So our trees in Florida, we always think of a tree having these really deep root systems. And again, if you go back to when you were a kid and you were drawing trees, you drew these really deep roots that went into the ground. Well, in Florida, we have a very high water table. So the roots can't go too far without getting into water typically. So they don't go very deep, but they go out wide because that's what keeps them standing. They need support, so they go out nice and wide. And typically we say the root system goes out 2 to 3 times the width of the canopy. So the drip line, the edge of the canopy where the water drips off, go out 2 to 3 times that, and that's where you're going to find the root systems of these trees. There is a root to shoot balance. So we have as much canopy as we have that 2 to 3 times root system. And if we alter one or the other, the canopy or the roots, the other one's going to suffer, right? So if we go into this tree and we just take half of the canopy off of it, the root system's going to suffer and it's going to die back. Or if we do development and we dig and we cut into, half of that root system, then the canopy's going to suffer. The roots support the canopy by sending food and moisture up there. And so if the roots aren't there to do that, then you're going to lose that canopy. So there is a balance there that we need to think about before we do construction, before we do a lot of digging into the root systems of these trees. So in this case, we had some damage to the root system, and the tree suffered. So you can see there, it's almost like the root that was feeding that part of the tree got damaged and that tree just died back. So that can happen from root damage. Herbicide damage can look like that too, but you have to be really careful with your root systems on your trees, or else you'll end up with situations like this and upset customers. So when we're pruning our trees can create these calluses and grow back over the cuts that we make. And that's what we want them to do. It takes time for the tree to do this, but that's what we want to happen. So how do we make that happen? Well, first of all, I don't want to see this out there. You guys know what happened here? Somebody went to cut the branch. So here's your branch. And let's say all the weight is over here. Lots of foliage on this branch, and somebody went to cut it and they started cutting from the top down, and all this heavy weight, once it got cut up here a little bit, pulled the branch down and it snapped. And when it snapped, it ripped all the bark underneath and pulled it all off the tree. Now we have a problem. That tree's never going to be a good tree now. It's got ripped bark. It's got all kinds of places for insects and fungus to get in there. So let's not do that. How do we avoid that from happening? We have to do a 1, 2, 3 cut. So our first cut, as you can see in the picture, cut number 1, is coming up just under the branch that we're going to make our cut on. So we cut just under that branch, just a little bit. If you cut up too high, what happens? You pinch your saw and good luck getting it out. It's hard to get out. You just need to cut the bark so you don't have to come up very high. Your second cut is out past that first cut, and you cut it to get the weight of the tree, of the branch off. So cuts 1 and 2 are really to deal with the weight of the branch and get rid of it. Cut number 3 is the important one. That's your money cut. Okay, you got to come back to the base of the tree, but then coming off just a little bit to leave that collar. If we don't leave that collar, it can't grow that callus back around it. So we need to come out just a little bit and make our cut there. So if we don't come off a little bit, we get these flush cuts, and you can see that cut with the arrow to it. It's flush against the trunk of the tree. That's not going to collar over. That's not going to be a good cut, and it'll always be open. For the rest of the life of that tree, that's going to be open, and that's a young tree. So we're talking lots of years, 40, 50, 60 years, that's going to be open. But the one at the bottom, just under it, they came off. You can see a little bit of collar there. You can see it starting to callus. That's a good cut there. So this is what we're looking for. Coming off the base of the tree a little bit, where that collar is, cutting outside the collar, and allowing that callus to form over it. That's a good pruning cut there. This is something I don't ever want to see you guys doing. It's called hat racking, or topping trees. When we prune trees, we should never take more than 30% of the canopy off of it. Remember what I said about that root to shoot thing? Well, when we take more than 30%, we start affecting the root system. So look at this line of trees. These trees are never going to be any good now. Never. They've ruined those trees. So whoever did that should have to pay to replace those trees. This is ugly. It can be very dangerous. These are roads, and now we're going to have weakened root systems. So it can be very dangerous. Not only is it that, it's bad for the tree, and it makes you look very unprofessional to do something like this. So before you tackle these jobs, if you don't understand tree pruning, get an arborist involved. Have an arborist come on site. So another thing that we see a lot, there's a lot of crepe myrtles in Manatee County, and a lot of crepe murder happening. And that is when we over prune our crepe myrtle trees, and we call it crepe murder. Every year you're coming back and you're hitting them at the same spot, right? We see, I call them chicken legs. They look like chicken legs all sticking in parking lots, because in the winter, there's not any foliage on crepe myrtles. They lose all their leaves, they go dormant. And so we trim them back so we don't have to look at a dead bush or tree. And I somewhat understand that, but I think if you don't want to look at a dead tree, then maybe you shouldn't have planted that tree right there. But even so, now you guys have to deal with it. They're in the landscape, you have to maintain them. But hitting them at the same spot every year causes this gnarled and weakened growth. So you can prune them, and they respond okay to pruning, but you need to hit them in different spots each year, not hitting them at the same spot every year, because I know you've seen that kind of knuckled, gnarled growth on them, and that can be, problematic for the tree as it keeps coming back year after year in that same spot. Another problem is this lion's tail. This is a real bad problem in this particular landscape. So I bet what happened, you see that retention wall there and all that nice new turf? I bet what happened is they got turf, and what did I say turf needs? 6 hours of light. Somebody said this turf isn't going to grow with that big tree. So they had somebody come in and thin that tree out, but they didn't do it quite right. So our trees are structured in a way that when the wind blows, they lean on the other branches. Okay, because they kind of support themselves as the wind blows. But now there's no support on that tree. So when the wind blows, that heavy top end of the branch doesn't have any support on the sides, and it's going to snap and come down. And I see power lines, I see a rooftop of a house. That is not a good situation. So again, when you're dealing with trees like this, if you don't know how to prune them, call somebody in that does, or else you could be finding yourself in a lawsuit. If that were to come down onto that client's roof, they might decide to sue you. So be very careful. When you're purchasing trees, we want to look for a good quality tree. And what does that look like? Well, if you look, the one that says good structure has a nice straight trunk coming up. We call that a leader, a nice straight dominant leader. We like that. We don't like the one that says poor structure, as it comes up and it starts to branch and yew and curve. Those are weaker branches. That's a weaker tree. We want that one with a nice, strong, dominant leader on it. Again, with the roots, you don't want to buy a tree that has all those girdling roots. You want to look at that. If that's what you see, put it back. Go to a different nursery if you have to, but don't buy those trees. It's a poor quality. So in these two trees, which one do you think is the weak one? Same parking lot. So even though the one closest to me here has a little bit of curve in its trunk, it's still a strong dominant leader. So we like that one better than the further one away, because you can see as it comes up it V's. And where that V is, the leaf litter, the water, it's all going to end up in that little V, and it's going to rot over time. And we don't know which branch is going to come down, but one of those branches is going to fail, right? Either the top side or the bottom side. One of them will fail over time. I don't know which one, and I don't know when it's going to happen, and I hope that you're not parked underneath it when it does. But we want to be careful that we're buying good quality trees to start with so we don't have these situations. I told you before, palms don't heal. This palm tree, somebody climbed it with spikes on their shoes to trim it, and the palm tree will never heal from that. They are monocots, so they're more closely related to grass than they are other trees. Their trunk system is just really a network of tubes going up and down. The cambium's kind of all throughout a palm tree trunk, where on other trees it's only in the inner bark layer. So they're just totally different. You got to treat them different. When we're pruning palm trees, we need to be really careful. A lot of times your homeowners are going to have you come out and prune this palm and say, oh, these fronds are yellow. I need you to get rid of all the yellow fronds. I don't want to look at them. Well, this palm tree has a problem. I can tell you what the problem is, and I can tell by looking at the yellowing on the palm fronds. Different problems present themselves differently, and palm trees give us these little clues and symptoms as to what's going on. So if you come out and prune all those yellow fronds off of that palm, I can't tell you what's happening now. So the palm starts to decline again, and you call me out, and I'm like, well, I can't see what's going on. Everything's been pruned away. But right now, I can tell from the way that it's being yellow, it needs some magnesium. This palm tree just needs a little nutrient, and it'll fix itself. So be careful not to prune away the symptoms so that we can diagnose what's going on. The other thing with palm trees is they store nutrients in their lower fronds. They start growing right up at the top. They have what's called a spear leaf that comes out, and then it opens up and it's a new frond. And so for it to get nutrient up to that spear leaf very quickly, it stores it down in the lower fronds. So it's pulling energy, food essentially, from those lower fronds up to the top. And so it's natural for it to yellow out at the bottom. But if you trim the palm frond every time it turns a little bit yellow, you're pulling food away from the tree, from that growing point. So you can trim the yellowing or the brown portions off, but try to leave the rest of the frond on there so it can pull that. And when we're pruning palms, we do not want to do this hurricane cut, okay? I still hear about the hurricane cut. Palms do not ever need to be pruned like this. When they're first put in the ground, this particular palm, and this is the only palm, which is a sable, is the only one that should be kind of absent of fronds, but only when it's first put in the ground. After that, it should have a full canopy all the time. The hurricane cuts are a big misconception. People think that they can get away with pruning it really tight like that and they won't have to prune as often. Or some people still think that, oh, there's a storm coming, heavy winds, we need to prune all these fronds off of it. Well, palm trees are just like other trees in the structure part of it. So you see that canopy, when the wind blows, it leans and supports itself. The top one doesn't have as much support, so those fronds are going to break off. It's going to be more stressed. It's better to leave your fronds on when the storms come instead of pruning it up tight like that. But with palm trees, we don't ever want to make a cut above a horizontal line. The 9 to 3 on there is supposed to be like the hands of a clock, a horizontal line. You should never prune anything up above the 9 to 3. Again, it pulls the nutrients from the lower fronds and sends it up. So if you have it pruned up real tight like that, it's going to pull those nutrients from those lower fronds, and you're going to end up pruning and pruning until you don't have any fronds left anymore. Our debris, when we're out pruning and we create lots of debris, we need to make sure that we're raking it up, not leaving any kind of clippings again behind. You can get fined for that. You don't want to leave them in the street. We do have landscape pickup days that you can put them out. Sometimes if you're doing a big pruning, you can pile it up on the sides and call, and they'll come out with the claw and pick it up. I don't know how many, but I know you get a certain number each year of those claw pickups. Of course, when we have storms, when we have hurricanes, then the county does that for everybody. You put everything out at the curb and they come with the claw and get it. When we're transporting all of the stuff that we're pruning, if you're transporting it off-site, you need to make sure that you're tarping your load. The Florida Highway Patrol is now FDOT. It used to be FDOT, the Department of Transportation, who would pull you over. Now, the Florida Highway Patrol, all of them are trained to do it. So they'll pull you over if they see a load that's not tarped. Not only is it, you should do it because you'll get a ticket, but the two pictures in the top here, you've got scale, you've got Brazilian pepper tree. Those things can go flying. So those little Brazilian pepper berries can go flying as you're driving down the road, and you're just spreading that invasive plant everywhere, or diseases everywhere. So tarp your load so you're not spreading the problem in our county, okay? Let's talk about mangroves. Mangroves are those coastal plants that grow with those really interesting root systems, and I've got some pictures of mangroves ahead, but I wanted to show you this picture because this is a coastline without mangroves and the damage after storms. Mangroves really help us. They protect our shorelines, so we don't want to remove them. A lot of people want them removed because they want to be able to see the water, but they don't want to be in this situation after a storm. Mangroves also help support a lot of wildlife. A lot of marine wildlife use the mangroves as nurseries to grow up in, to feed. They're just really important. They're their own little ecosystem. So here's one of the types of mangroves that we have. This is a red mangrove. It's got the reaching roots, those really interesting roots that reach out into the water, but those really help hold our shoreline in place. They can tolerate that wave coming at it, and they actually, here comes the wave, and it hits the roots and it disperses the energy of the wave. So it doesn't impact the shoreline as heavily. We have 3 types of mangroves in Manatee County. We've got the red, the black, and the white, and they grow in different zones along the coastline there. But my message to you, leave them alone. It takes a certain type of professional. You need to be an arborist, or you need to have some kind of certification to get a permit to prune mangrove trees. So you don't want to be the guy getting a big old fine from the Department of Environmental Protection because you pruned mangrove trees because your client said, I can't see the water and I want to be able to see the water. When you see these types of trees, start asking questions, because as a pruning professional, somebody getting paid to prune, you have requirements that are much higher than the homeowner's requirement. Homeowners can do things to their mangroves that you're not allowed to do. So you need to ask questions and find out the answers. My advice to you is don't touch them. Find an arborist so you don't get in trouble. The other thing that's happened in our county is not only are mangroves protected, but other vegetation can be protected too. And what happened was we had a home that was across the street from the beach, and the home could not see. So it started that there was a beach access, and the home could see through that beach access to the water. Well, the county came in to try to help with shoreline stabilization, and they planted sea grapes in the beach access. The sea grapes grew up tall, and when they grew up, that home couldn't see down that beach access anymore into the water. So he paid a landscape guy to come in and prune all those sea grapes down. And when I say prune, I'm talking he took them down like 15 feet. And the county got super upset about this. Number one, they weren't his trees to prune. Number two, that access, and on the sides of that access were actually coastal dunes. The access itself went through a coastal dune, and so what was on the sides was a coastal dune. Any native vegetation in a coastal dune cannot be pruned or removed without a permit. So sea grapes are native, and they needed a permit to be able to do that. So that landscape company got into quite a bit of trouble. So I don't want that to be you making the paper. That made the paper a couple of times. We don't want your business name in the paper. So make sure if you're out on the beach and it's, in a real sandy area, that you're checking to make sure that you're not on a coastal dune before you're pruning, because that's happened actually a couple of times. There was another situation where a condo planted sea grapes to keep the beachgoers from coming up onto their property. So they wanted a dividing line, and the sea grapes grew up, and the condo owners complained because their view was hindered. So they had somebody come in and prune the mangroves back real hard, and the mangroves were on a coastal dune. So they got in trouble. So you want to make sure that you're abiding by all the rules and regulations when it comes to pruning mangroves. You can come to our office. We've got booklets on it that you're welcome to read about. You can call the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They are the ones who police mangrove trimmings. So they take aerial photos and look at the befores and afters, and then go find out who did it. So they are watching. You need to make sure you get your proper permits if you're going to prune them. Okay, this is our last section, and we're going to talk about pest control. And again, this is a different license, okay? In order for you to spray pesticides, you have to have a pesticide license. But I just want to go over some of the basics so that you understand. So of course, you have to have a license. There's several different types of licenses that can apply to spraying outdoors. One of them is the limited commercial maintenance license, and this allows folks that go what we call route to route, home to home, to spray pesticide in the landscape. Now you're only allowed to use what's called a caution label, but if you spray herbicide like Roundup or glyphosate, you need this license, because when you're spraying an herbicide, a weed is a pest, it's a pesticide. Okay, so if you're spraying Roundup, you do have to have a pesticide license. And if you're going route to route to route or home to home, you need the limited commercial landscape maintenance. We teach those classes. I'd be happy to help you with that. If you work for the government, you would need a limited lawn and ornamental license to spray on government properties. Then there is the folks that spray out in the turf. Okay, the limited commercial landscape maintenance license, the one above here, is only allowed to spray in the landscape beds. If you want to be able to spray in the turf, you need what I call the MacDaddy license, which is the Pest Control Operator, or PCO license. This requires that you work for somebody that has one of these licenses for 3 years. You have to keep track of your spray records, you have to keep track of your payroll, and you submit all of that to the Florida Department of Ag and Consumer Services, or FDACS, before you can sit to take the test. The test is a long test. It's 300 questions. It's not super easy, but this would allow you to spray restricted use products, caution use products, but also spray in the turf. Most of the folks that have this license are like your big spray companies. They typically just spray, like the Massey's, the Southern Greens, the True Green Nolans. Those are your PCO companies. And a lot of times, folks that just maintain landscapes, you guys often will contract these people to come do the spray for you so you don't have to maintain that license. So the first license, again, only allows you to spray in landscape beds, products like Roundup or caution pesticide products. You do have to have your own license. So whoever sprays has to have the license when it's the limited commercial landscape maintenance. When it's the PCO license, that's the Mac Daddy one, he or she can have the license and supervise lots of people. I think it's up to 30 people under them that they can supervise. When we're talking about pesticide applications, we like to practice what's called integrated pest management, or IPM. And this is, instead of just going and grabbing the harshest chemical that we have, keeping that sprayer on our truck, and every little thing we see, hitting it with that heavy duty spray, it's a whole different tactic. It's looking at, what could have caused this problem? Are we overwatering? Well, let's turn back the water. Are we over fertilizing? Let's turn back the fertilizer. Maybe we spread it ourselves on our nippers. Maybe our nippers weren't clean and we spread the problem. So let's clean our nippers and prevent some of these things from happening. So integrated pest management, it's this whole toolbox of techniques and strategies to try to keep us from even using pesticides in the first place. But we know that there are problems out there, and sometimes we do have to use a pesticide, and that's okay, but let's not always grab the heaviest, most toxic pesticide and use it for a little aphid that we could get rid of with some soap and water. So IPM techniques include sanitation, mechanical controls. When we have weeds, sometimes we can just mow and knock down our weeds. Cultural controls, which is really most of this presentation was about, mulching, mowing with sharp blades. Those are all kind of cultural controls. Biological controls, sometimes we have ladybugs and things in the landscape that can help us with our problems. Sometimes we just need to cut back the water and the fertilizer, or sometimes we have to get plants that are resistant to pests. Nematodes can be a real issue out there. We have a lot of nematode issues on plants. So looking for those plants that are nematode resistant in those areas that we know we have nematodes, that can be very helpful. When we're looking at pesticides, the label is the law. This is the only place that the manufacturer can tell you what you need to know about this product, and it is the law. It's a federal law. If you apply more than what it says, you're breaking a federal law. If you don't wear the proper protection for yourself that the label states, you're breaking a federal law. So it's important that all applicators know that, even with fertilizer, the label is the law. So what we've covered today, well, we've talked about water quality issues, about different sources of pollution, point source and non-point source, fertilizer and pesticide licensing certifications. We've talked about landscape designs, landscape installations, irrigation, mulch, mowing, and pruning, and some pest control, best management practices. So we know that our time is short. We haven't spent a long time to go into great detail. We could have classes on each one of these topics that could go for a day. So if you want to learn more, we do offer more in-depth classes. We offer in Manatee County a program called Hort Talks. They're 4 hours long. We offer CEUs, which are continuing education units for license holders. But you don't have to be a license holder to come to those classes. You can come just to listen. So check out our calendar of events. You can find it online at our website, which is on the next slide, and come see us. So this is my information if you have questions. This is how you can contact me, my email, and then our website. So the manatee.ifas.ufl.edu. When you go to that website, you'll go to where it talks about landscape professionals, and you'll find resources like this video, licensing class information, CEU information, all on that website. So you've watched this video, good job. Hopefully you've learned some new tricks and tips for your maintenance business. Now, how do you get the certificate and the decal that you need to be compliant with our fertilizer ordinance? Well, you have to call us and come in and take an exam. And I'm sorry, I wish I could offer an online exam, but there's no way to verify that it's actually you taking that exam online. So we have to have you come into the office so we know that it's you. So the phone number here, 941-722-4524, you can call that number and tell them that you need to set up a test to get your certification, and we'll set an appointment with you. If you're with a company, your whole company can come in at the same time. We can get you your tests. Once you pass the test, and you do have to pass it, it's 20 questions, then we can get you your certificate and your decal, and then you'll be compliant so long as you're not applying fertilizer and pesticide in the landscape. So thank you for listening and taking the time. I look forward to meeting you or seeing you in the office when you come in for your exam. These are just some resources, and I want to thank those who helped me put this presentation together. So thank you.